to morality as such. You'll notice that my first slide, when I was a kid, I went through my astronomy phase, my geology phase, and my chemistry phase, and I had one of these old-fashioned balances. But it is a good metaphor for utilitarian moral theory, the idea of an old-fashioned chemical balance. Because, what this moral theory recommends is that we look at the consequences, or at least try to predict what the consequences will be of what we're planning to do if we're weighing between doing A or doing B, and basically choosing the option that on balance gives you the most good, or at least the least amount of negative consequences, and this is kind of washed out. I'm going to do this for about 15, 20 minutes and go over the objective part of the task for folks who just walked in. This, So the idea of a chemical balance is a good metaphor for this, as I said. Now, we did not look at ethical egoism. I use these slides in a number of different situations, some of which I'm going more deeply into other ethical theories. But ethical egoism is another moral theory. Ayn Rand is a famous proponent of that. And they both fit into a class of moral views called consequentialist theories. And the word consequentialist is very suggestive of what's important to these theories, and that is that we should weigh the consequences of our actions and choose, the course that promotes the most good in terms of consequences. But where those theories differ is in answering the question, consequences for whom. So consequentialism holds that the only factors relevant to determining the morality of what we do, whether what we do is morally right or morally wrong, are the results. It very much is the end justifies the means. I mean, that cliche fits these theories. And when I did this little graphic, it wasn't by accident that I put the C's for consequences out in front, because when you think about it, where are the consequences of what we do? I mean, on a timeline, right, they're all located in the future. So these theories are forward-looking to consequences of necessity, but it also becomes a a criticism of these views because they effectively make the past morally irrelevant. Something we did in the past is irrelevant. In their theory of punishment, for instance, utilitarianism faces, wants us to balance out consequences and think about things like rehabilitation of an offender, protection of society, and deterrence. But all of those look to the future consequences. One thing utilitarianism cannot capture morally is the notion of desert, that somebody should be punished simply because they deserve to be punished for what they did. Or on the other side, you say, hey, I worked very hard in this class. I deserve an A on the basis of the work I did. Well, those kinds of decisions are looking back at what you did in the past. If you say, hey, look, morally, I'm the one who deserves the promotion in my job situation to supervisor because of my great record for this company over the past 5 years. Well, the notion of desert is a backward-looking notion, in a positive sense. But these theories cannot capture that kind of thing. But they all are concerned with figuring out what we ought or ought not to do. Egoism and utilitarianism differ as consequentialist theories. And by the way, the biggest hurdle in ethics is getting a handle on all the 50-cent words that are thrown around. I used to do special handouts on vocabulary when I taught a whole semester ethics courses. So consequentialism, where these theories differ, egoism and utilitarianism, is if you ask, well, who's, the consequences, we're supposed to weigh the consequences of our actions to decide the right thing to do, but what consequences are we supposed to take into account? Well, egoism is controversial because it says the only consequences that matter morally are the consequences for me. That is, that my number one moral obligation should be to make those choices that provide me with the best results or consequences, and the consequences for other people are morally irrelevant, whether they be good or bad. So it's very much a theory that says our chief moral obligation is to look out for number one. Number one, of course, being ourselves. And I point this out, note I have the C's pointing to one person, which would be the person making the moral choice, the doer of the action. Whereas utilitarianism has gotten many more advocates because it says, it captures the notion, and I think it's no matter what moral position we come from, we have this notion that very often doing the right thing morally may mean choosing the course of action that's not necessarily the best course of action for me if I just consider what's best for me. And we're going to see this in a little example that I have. And so very often the best course of action morally involves making choices where we may have to put our own self-interest aside. So utilitarianism says the consequences we ought to promote are the best consequences for everyone affected by what we do. And if it's something like a public policy, you know, for society in general. Well, these are some statements, they're summaries of the principle of utility from some other textbooks. Now, Bentham's own statement is a bit flowery and convoluted. So I put these more straightforward. Say, always act so as to bring about the greatest net good for all those affected by your actions. Or always act for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. I mean, that's the phrase to keep in mind. This theory says promote the greatest good for the greatest number. But one thing that we already saw in that video on the Bakun Dam, that it's consistent with the claim that we have taken the course of action that provided the greatest good for the greatest number, that some subset of the population may not fare very well indeed. You know, it's consistent with the claim that on balance you've chosen a course of action which provides for the greatest good for the greatest number, that somebody, someone's interests are not promoted at all. In fact, that somebody or some group comes out worse. And this is, you know, an aspect of this theory that it can be controversial, and that has caused many people to reject it. We saw, for instance, that the interests of the displaced native villagers, 30 villages, 10,000 inhabitants, building the Bakun Dam, they're going to be displaced. They don't necessarily want to move. Their interests are not being promoted, but maybe the interests of hundreds of thousands of Malaysian people who might have a higher standard of living because you now have cheaper and more available electrical power where there was none before. You know, their interests come out to the positive side. So, but note the phrase in both of these, promote the greatest good or the greatest net good. This raises the question, well, what do we mean by good? Consequentialist moral theories are part of a group of theories called theories of obligation. I'm not going to ask you this phrase, right? In other words, they try to give us a decision procedure for deciding what's the right thing to do. What are we obligated to do morally in this situation? But along with the theory of obligation, you generally have a theory of value. And we saw this in Plato and Aristotle, right? For Plato, moral good is otherworldly. It exists in the form of the good in the ideal world of the forms. For Aristotle, it is eudaimonia, the feeling of well-being or happiness. And Aristotle was not the only philosopher to focus on the idea of good being happiness, or in this case, pleasure. It was especially the early hedonists. Hedonism, in its Greek form, was kind of egoistic. I want to look to promote the most pleasurable results for me. The early utilitarians, to the left, Jeremy Bentham. How about Jeremy Bentham's last wishes? He sat on the board. I think it was the University of London, and he left instructions that he should be able to continue to attend board meetings after his death. And so that's why we get Bentham in a box. And I did talk with Ross Harrison, the guy who you saw in the video, who looked exactly like that back in 1995 when I was over there for a different conference. But we were talking about Bentham, and he mentioned that they had moved Bentham from the boardroom to a more public place, and which is where we saw him. But at any rate, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, the founders in the 19th century. But what they did was they took a very old view of moral goodness, and they're writing after Hume's moral skepticism. How are we going to be able to get around a moral skepticism that says we can't even reason about matters morally? Well, they thought that the way we can do it, the way we can kind of find new foundations for moral theory, is to make ethics very much rooted in things having to do with this world, with things that we can experience here. And so they adopted this very old Greek view of hedonism to define moral goodness, but they made it believable and sellable to a very sophisticated 19th century audience by giving it a universal twist. Instead of just promoting our own pleasure, we should be about the business of promoting the most happiness or pleasure for society in general, for everyone affected. So they define the good as the pleasurable and the bad as the painful. So this brings morality and moral theory down to earth. Now doing the right thing isn't rooted in some other worldly principles. It's a simple matter of choosing those courses of action which provide the greatest good in terms of happiness for people in this world, in the here and now. So, but hedonism, and we saw this point with Aristotle, if you want an ultimate standard, then it has to be something that is intrinsically good. That is, we talked about this distinction before, good for its own sake alone. That contrasts with the phrase instrumentally good, good because it promotes some other good. So, in other words, that it's an instrument in promoting another good. And I gave an example that one of my textbooks used to use. Somebody might say, well, it's good eating healthy food. So it says, well, why is it good eating healthy food? Well, if you eat healthy foods, you're going to be healthier yourself. Well, why is it so important to be healthy? Well, besides things like being more productive, people who are healthier are generally happier people. They have more enjoyable lives. Well, why is it good to be happy? Well, for the hedonist, happiness is not good because it promotes some other end. Happiness is good, excuse me, in and of itself. And the theory of hedonism basically says that pleasure or happiness, and when we're talking the early utilitarians like Bentham, these words are interchangeable. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled in scholarly journals over whether or not they are interchangeable, pleasure and happiness. And you can make the case for they're not being quite the same thing. But at the philosophy 101 level, we can look at them as interchangeable. So hedonism says that there's only one thing that's good and worth promoting for its own sake alone, and that's pleasure or happiness. Every other good is good only instrumentally. It's good only insofar as it ultimately leads to more happiness or less unhappiness, but not in and of itself. So any other good is good only insofar as it promotes pleasure or lessens pain, but not for its own sake. And so, for people who walked in, we are going to go to the objective part of the test. Due to an illness I had last week, I've been really behind. So, your essays I'm going to get back to you, unfortunately, Thursday morning. But we will go over the objective part, and you'll know what you got on that. I wanted to wait till there were more people in, which there obviously are. So we're not going to go on for too much longer here. So here are Bentham and Mill, and they're trying to get out a moral theory that deals with Hume's skeptical claims that that morality is really a matter of sentiment rather than reason, and that it's pointless to try to reason about ethical issues. Bentham and Mill want to get back away to respectably, philosophically, and rigorously reason about morality, or enable us to reason about morality. Now, you know what? I'm not really going to stick on this slide. I'm also teaching a critical thinking course, and we talk about fallacies there. And there's a fallacy called the fallacy of four terms, or if you change the meaning of a word in midstream in an argument, you commit a fallacy because the way you're using a term in the premises may not be the way you're using it in the conclusion, so you really haven't proved your conclusion. And Mill tried to to defend this view that pleasure is the only good by saying, well, that pleasure is desirable as the ultimate good can be seen from this. That he says, well, what's the test that something is visible or that something is audible? Well, that it can be seen or that it can be heard. I'm paraphrasing. So what's the test that something is desirable as an end? Well, that people are actually able to desire it. And people do, in fact, desire a happier, more pleasurable life. But essentially his argument uses desirable in the sense that pleasure is the kind of thing that people do and can desire. It's able to be desired. But if he's trying to prove that it should be the ultimate standard of morality, what he needs to show is that pleasure is not just something that we can desire, but that is what we ought to desire as the ultimate end. The ultimate end should be to promote the most happiness in society and the least amount of pain. And he does not prove that pleasure is desirable in that sense as an ultimate end. So they don't really succeed in trying to defend this view. But the early utilitarians then were hedonists, and Bentham, sometimes you start out, and maybe it's Occam's razor, I don't know. You start out with the thought that you've got a really straightforward view, and then criticisms of it make it more complicated. Scientific theories are this way. And Bentham started out with a very simple view, and that's that the right thing to do is to promote the most happiness over unhappiness, pleasure over pain. And we ought to weigh the projected pleasure versus pain of various consequences and choose the side that either has the most pleasure or the least pain for all concerned. But Bentham started out with this simple view that all pleasures are basically on a par, which is probably very consistent with hedonism. In other words, that well, let's put it this way. I mean, if you get the same amount of pleasure out of a video game as somebody might get from listening to Mozart or reading, high-level poetry, then they're the same. And so Bentham started out with two very simple assumptions that got him into trouble. One is that all pleasures are on a par. And pushpin, from what I've read, is a simple child's game, something like pick up sticks. And so Bentham's quote is, quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpins is as good as poetry. All pleasures are on a par. And then what we're going to look at next time is Bentham's overly optimistic attempt to get out what he called a hedonistic calculus. Don't let the word calculus fool you. Calculus in a more general sense is just a system within which calculations are made. And here we're just talking about adding and subtracting very simple positive and negative numbers. But Bentham thought that we could actually assign countable units to There's some real problems with this, which we'll look at later. But there's a very simple illustration that I got years ago from the old Paul Edwards Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which was out there for years as the main one. Now there are plenty of others, but it illustrates, this idea of balancing out pain versus pleasures. And one way to look at the decision of whether to build something like the Bakun Dam is in totally hedonistic terms. Now, never mind the economics of the situation. We're going to make some people very unhappy and sad because we're going to displace 10,000 inhabitants of those native villagers. But can we balance that out against the positive consequences of giving hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people a better lifestyle with the cheap electricity that comes from the dam and jobs and stuff like that? And all that matters is the net result here. Basically, utilitarian theory is a theory where the individual fades into the background. It's only the total balance of pain versus pleasure that's morally relevant. So we'll look at that next time then. Let me, I guess I'll pause it. Again, I'm trying to integrity these things. So I'm going to go through this because it's actually kind of entertaining almost. He developed a hedonic or hedonistic calculus, and the thing is, he thought that we would take in various factors. Your book, I think, lists them all. I don't go into all the subtleties, but in other words, how are you going to give values to pleasures and pains? Well, think about it. You would take to account in assigning numbers things like how intense a pleasure or pain is, intensity, duration, how long would it last? I mean, we have a multi-billion-dollar, pain reliever industry, built around the fact that if you can get rid of your headache in 20 minutes by taking XYZ company's pill, whereas it might go on, the pain might go on for 3 hours. If you don't, you're going to do it. And also things like remoteness and certainty. In other words, suppose only $19 will go in the tank. You say that's such an old illustration. Who has a tank that only $19 worth of gas would go in? Suppose you already are half full or something, and so you got a dollar change and it's burning a hole in your pocket, and you can either buy a candy bar or chips or something, or you buy a lottery ticket. Well, presumably, if you hit the lottery, you'd get a lot more pleasure off of the winnings than just eating a Hershey bar or whatever. But think about it. Even if you're only playing a 3-digit number, there's a rather low probability that you're going to hit the lottery. But there's pretty much 100% probability that you can enjoy the chips or the Hershey bar or whatever you buy with the dollar. So things like certainty and uncertainty were other things. Now here's where Bentham gets a little controversial. He actually thought that we could assign countable units. this is the kind of stuff, folks, you can't make up. He talked about hedons. In other words, we can talk about temperature, right? How hot is it in here? And it's starting to get a little warm. In terms of degrees Celsius or degrees Kelvin or degrees Fahrenheit, right? We've got a countable unit. Well, he thought you could measure, you could quantify pains and pleasures in countable units. Now, hospitals even today, and I always get somebody who works in medicine, you know, they'll have a scale, on a scale of 1 to 10, where's your pain today? But those are still kind of subjective, you know. But Bentham thought we could objectively talk about pleasures and pains. And okay, I'm just going to go this one real quick. This is one I've used for years, but it illustrates, it's a much simpler example than the Bakun Dam, right? But it illustrates this idea of how utilitarian theory works as far as balancing out. Suppose you have a very simple moral decision to do. You're the uncle, and there's a circus in town, and your moral decision is whether to take your nephew to the circus Saturday or whether to stay home and read a book that you would enjoy. And you're a utilitarian, so you want to take into account, you know, the most good for everyone affected by your action. So, suppose circuses just don't do it for you. They did when you were a kid, but been there, done that, right? Suppose the uncle's going to be bored if he takes the kid to the circus. Well, this highlights something about what Bentham calls pleasure and pain. It's a very broad use of the word. One writer I read said pleasantness versus unpleasantness might be a better way of talking about it. Right? You don't want to be bored. You know, not everything in life is as exciting as philosophy class. There are boring things out there. So let's say minus 5 hedons worth of pain. I mean, boredom's a mild pain. Is what the uncle's going to feel if he takes the kid to the circus. But it's going to get some sympathetic pleasure. I mean, if you have younger, you know, siblings or even your own children, you can get pleasure out of seeing them open a birthday gift or a Christmas gift or something. That's what we mean by sympathetic pleasure. Pleasure you get at somebody else's enjoyment. So if the kid enjoys the circus, he's going to, you know, get pleasure from that. And then there's the nephew's pleasure himself. And let's say the kid really enjoys circuses, so that's plus 10 hedons. So on this side of the ledger, you basically get plus 7 hedons, right, adding positive and negative numbers. Now, suppose you read the book. Well, you're not going to be bored by it. You're going to get the nephew. I mean, as the uncle, you're going to get, say, plus 6 hedons worth of pleasure. Maybe not as much pleasure as a kid would get from the circus. But now, if you're sitting home reading the book knowing that you have disappointed your nephew, you'll have some sympathetic pain at your nephew's disappointment. Let's call it minus 2 hedons. And then there's the nephew's disappointment itself, minus 8 hedons. So here on this side, you've got minus 4 hedons, right? You've got plus 6, minus 10, minus 4. Now, it's not always a plus versus minus. Sometimes it's between 2 minuses. sometimes it's between two pluses. But what's the morally right thing to do for all concerned?
Go to the circus.
Yeah, go to the circus, right? Now note, though, that this choice is not the choice where the uncle comes out having the most pleasurable experience, right? The net pleasure for the uncle here is -5 and +2. It's -3 hedons for the uncle, whereas here it's +6, -2, or +4 hedons. So note, the uncle is literally making the choice that he thinks is best for all concerned, but it's not the best choice for him in terms of bringing about the most pleasure for him. And this captures our intuition that sometimes doing the right thing is not always the course of action where we come out, the best. Now, can everyone see how we got these numbers? I mean, this would be +10, -8. So the numbers are self-evident to everyone. You know that that's a trick question, right? I mean, when we're talking about comparing other people's pains and pleasures, first of all, can we see into their minds? Go back to Descartes, not really, right? So there are real problems with, how do I project other people's pains and pleasures? I mean, just for, I have about time, for a short time, dated this young woman who was a divorcee when I was in grad school. She had 2 young children, took them to a local county fair outside of Charlottesville. They were advertising a demolition derby. Well, as a kid from Baltimore City, I'd love to go see cars running into each other, smashing each other up, appeals to your urban nature. So I actually, it was an extra ticket, took us all. The kids did not like it. Maybe that's one reason why I never worked there. They were afraid that the cars were going to explode. At the time, I didn't know that they actually take the real gas tank out and put like a quart plastic bottle of gas so it won't explode. But the point is, I try to predict what these kids would enjoy. As Uncle Vic, there was a point, when my niece and nephews were growing up, that, I realized it's better to get the gift card and let them get what they want to try to guess. It was okay when they were very young. So it's hard to try to predict other people's pains and pleasures. So consequences are a very elusive thing, plus, and this is the last point I'm going to make. This subjective quality of pains and pleasures. In other words, the heat in this room is intersubjectively verifiable. We can have a countable unit. But pains and pleasures are subjective in a way that makes it almost impossible to specify with any exactness what one hedon is going to be, what one unit of pain, one unit of pleasure, or -1 hedon, 1 unit of pain is going to be. Well, the point is, you can't get off the ground counting something if you can't standardize on a unit. In other words, if you don't know, how do you know whether you have 2 or 10 or 20 of something if you don't know what it is to have 1 of something? And the problem with Bentham's original view is that it doesn't seem like we can calculate pleasures and pains with that kind of exactitude. Now you can say we do make rough and ready comparisons, right? I can say, you know, my headache is much worse today than the one I had yesterday. But again, that still doesn't establish the point that Bentham made, that we can attach exact numbers. And Bentham was convinced that we could. So there's a real problem. One of the ways that modern utilitarianism, and there's a later slide on this, deals with this is by economics. I mean, we know what counts as $1, right? So if we say the morally right course of action is a course of action that gives us the most economic benefits for the costs involved, weighs costs versus benefits, a cost-benefit analysis, then we do. Now we're working with a unit that we know and we can count, you know. And another way of looking at the Bakun Dam situation rather than comparing pains and pleasures is look at it economics. Are the benefits of building the dam going to be more than outweighed? I mean, are they going to outweigh the cost, the downside? You know. So okay. Again, so all right. So the paper can be handed in without penalty a week from today, but I'll give somebody a bonus for handing it in either today or Thursday. Thank you very much for coming and have a good day. Okay, thanks. If anyone missed the roll, I'll just put it up here with a pen. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Did you need the scan for it?
No, I actually said post the scan card, so that's all recorded.
So you're gonna.
Yeah.
I don't know why it got messed up.
Oh, well, I can see why. Yeah, you know, it's really weird. You know, with your eye, sometimes somebody has a really good erasure and it still will mark it wrong. And then there are other times when someone has this smudgy erasure and it's not bothered, you know. These machines, yeah. So 3 was B. Oh, okay. Thanks. Yeah, right. I mean, it looks like you did a pretty good job of erasing, but it still burned you, didn't it?
Yeah. It's just weird because they were all B, the ones that were messed up. I don't know if it's a pattern or just.
Yeah. Right. I mean, here you're getting into the questions about the mind, what's going on in the mind of the Scantron machine, and I can't. So Scott Thompson. So that's. I always break down a test on a legal pad, and that because the only thing that gets entered in a grade book is the fun.
And you said there was a curve on this one?
There will be. I need to see where the essays come out. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, as I have it recorded, I don't want anything to slip through the cracks.
Yeah.
That's significant. Yeah.
That's a good reason. I mean, it
But
picked up the one.
yes, I mean that should be a good. And look at this one. What's the difference between that erasure and that erasure? And yet this one it did fine, and the
This
other
is
one.
the only one that I think can justify that issue. I mean, it's sort of darker than.
Yeah, that one was a little darker, but the other two, it doesn't seem like it's any different than the other. I know it's hard to
have a check, though.
predict.